Today we're working on a 2004 Dodge Ram 3500. This is the HD with the dualies. We're going to be replacing the front brake pads and rotors. So first, have it jacked up, take the tire off. If you have the dualies, then you'll also have this spacer, and it can look intimidating at first, but it's really not that difficult. So we'll run through the process on how that all comes apart. So first I like to do is take the steering wheel, turn it, so I can expose the bolts for the caliper and everything. Gives me really good access to that backside there. So first thing we want to do is take these bolts off here for the spacer, and you put a screwdriver in these, you can see these fins in the rotor, and put them in between the caliper and the fins. And what that'll do is prevent the hub from spinning while we put 7/8 is the size on there, and you most likely have to beat it with a hammer to get it off. These are torqued to close to 100 foot-pounds, so it takes a little beating, unless you have a longer wrench with some pry, but this little hammer works to knock it loose. So we'll knock all those off. There's 8 of them. So once you have all the nuts off, then it just separates from the hub like that. Sometimes it could get a little stuck on this lip. If that happens, you can just take a hammer and knock the backside of this spacer here and just knock around it, and it'll eventually pop off that hub. Sometimes it gets stuck on the lip, but this one didn't. So now that that's off, we can focus on getting the rotor off. I mean the rotor, but the caliper's next. So from here, because the wheel speed sensor is tied into the brake line, just to protect the wheel speed sensor from accidentally getting yanked, you can disconnect it from these clips here. Just these 2 here is all that needs to be done. And then you're separating at least this portion of the brake hose and the wheel speed sensor. Get that out of the way. And then once you do that, then there's a 10 mil here and a 10 mil at the bottom of the caliper, and then that can separate and be put out of the way. Okay, now that we have the caliper removed, we have it suspended with a bungee cord, and you can see these pads they are toast. To get the caliper bracket off, there's an 18 millimeter up and down there that we can back out, and then that'll pull this caliper bracket off. The rotor should come off right after that. Just a tip, if you have the heavy duty 3500, these are going to be monstrous tight. So I recommend getting some kind of breaker bar or cheater bar to get those off. They'll be pretty tight. If you don't have the heavy duty, they're still pretty tight. So anyway, just a little tip, something long to get those with. Now that bracket's off, the rotor pretty much just comes off like any other rotor. If yours is, sometimes they do get stuck on the hub. Because you're replacing it, don't worry, just hit it, smack on the back of it. You don't have to try to hit in between here to save it, because it's getting replaced. So just mash on the back until it pops off. This one came off like butter, so no worries there. All right, so we're gonna pull that off and then prep our new rotor for installation. Anytime you have new rotors, they'll have you can even see kind of a film on them to protect them during storage from rust. So you just want to, any kind of brake clean, clean it off real good, both sides, even in and out, because as this heats up, it'll heat up everything else, and you'll get that smell for a couple of days. And it might not be a big deal for you, but if you're doing this for a customer, just clean it off real good, and they won't have to worry about what that smell is. Anyway, so that'll be the next step there, cleaning that off. And then I'll show you when I'm finished, but on this hub surface here, I like to put just a little anti-seize, just a little to coat it, and that'll help prevent rust or anything from building up over time between now and the next brake service. So for the anti-seize, you can see I just put little dabs in between, and then I'll just use my finger to thin it out and rub it around just the best I can. Doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to glob it on. Don't get this on your rotors or brake pads or anything like that, but it just helps. If I do the brakes next time in 5 years or so, I'm going to thank myself. If somebody else is doing the brakes, then they'll thank me. But anyway, it doesn't take a lot. You're just creating a rust inhibitive surface there. But anyway, so that's that. And then you can go ahead and put the rotor on. Now that the rotor's on, to keep it from, you can see it wants to wobble. To keep it locked in place, I'll just go ahead and put the spacer back on. Tighten all these down, just snug them. We'll torque them later. and that'll lock this in so it doesn't wobble on you. If your vehicle does not have one of these spacers, that's okay. You can use one of the lug nuts, because this goes just all the way through, and just, you know, snug it down, and then that'll also prevent the rotor from moving. It just makes it easier when you put the caliper back on if the rotor's stationary. Now that these are snug and the rotor's locked in, it's not going to move on us, we can go ahead and prep our brake caliper bracket. So this is where the new hardware sits. So just, you know, clean it up and make sure that the new hardware is just going to sit in there nice. And then the way the brackets go in, they have these little slots on the bottom of it, so it only goes in one way. These tabs here go to the outside, but you can't get it wrong because it only goes on one way. So that's nice. So once we get the hardware on the caliper bracket, we can go ahead and bolt that in. The caliper bracket bolts did have Loctite on them, so I'm going to go ahead and reapply new Loctite on these before insertion. Now these caliper bracket bolts are, if you have the HD or the SRT 10, those two, these are torqued to 250 foot-pounds, which is pretty insane, but that's what they're torqued to. If you have the light duty pickup truck or LD, it's calling for 130. That's the only difference between the two torque specs. So we'll get those torqued, and then we're ready to put our pads on and then prep our caliper for installation. So there's two things we need to do to the caliper. The slide pins need to be greased. There's two of them, and then these pistons need to be pushed back. In order to get the slide pins out, they just come out of this boot here. Let's see if I can pull it out one-handed. There we go. Oh, sorry about that. So wipe these off real good. When you put them back in, because the boot is really tight, it'll just wipe off the grease that you just put on this pin. So what I recommend is, let me show you. On my grease, I have a little applicator tip here, and then I'll put this in and then just grease the inside real good like that, and then throw some on the pin and then put it in, and then that'll get it the best that I can. But I noticed if you just put it on the pin and push it in, then this boot just pretty much wipes what you just put on off. So because these are dual piston, what I like to do, I have my brake caliper piston tool, but I put a brake pad, an old one, in there, so when I'm pushing on this side doesn't want to just pop out, and then when I come over to this side doesn't want to just pop out. So by using a brake pad, when I squeeze this side, it'll keep this side down, and then sometimes it'll also squeeze this side, depending on how easy these are to move. You can use a tool like this. They're pretty cheap to get. I think you can rent them from the auto parts store as well. If you can also use just something like this, I've used before as well. But so after these are lubed, pushing these pistons back is next. And I started running out of daylight. So once the caliper's pistons have been pushed back and the caliper's on, so the left side and right side are just a tad different. When I did the right side first, the caliper came up off the bottom, and then the top tilted out to come down. On this driver's side, it's the opposite. When you put this in, it goes up first and then pivots down. You can see this right here. That's why that opening is there. So the top goes in underneath this tab, and then the bottom pivots and locks into this little groove here. So just keep that in mind. The left side and right side are opposite of each other as far as how the caliper gets put in. Anyway, these 10mm bolts here, top and bottom, are torqued to 24 foot-pounds. And then you can put the wheel speed sensor back in their little slots, and that'll button up this job. So then once that's done, we'll torque these down, and I'll give you the specs on that. So now that the caliper's back on and tightened, we can now put the torque down the spacer here. And it's just the opposite of before. So put the screwdriver in those fins, if I could find them. There we go. So screwdriver's locking the rotor down. Now we can tighten these, and these are tightened to 96 foot-pounds. and then how you can tighten them as well. There's 8 of them, just like your lug nut pattern. So you can do crisscross, this one, and then one straight over, this one, then the one straight over, this one, kind of making that crisscross pattern for tightening these as well. So 96 foot-pounds, and they're ready to put the tire on, take it for a break-in test drive, and that's it. You're complete. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.